Hello, it's Marite and welcome back to another episode of Sound Scribe. Today I'm going to be interviewing Jamin Smith, who was a narrative designer for the audio game Three Monkeys. Now, Three Monkeys launched a Kickstarter back in 2015, I think it was, but unfortunately they never reached their goal and therefore they never got to go into full production. But the game did have an amazing potential and I am very, very curious to see what Jamin has to say about designing narratives for an audio-only game. So without further ado, let's go talk to Jamin. All right, well, Jamin, welcome and thank you for being here today. We're going to be talking about Three Monkeys, a game that you were involved with. First of all, tell us a bit about yourself.
So my name is Jamin Smith. Worked in the games industry for over a decade now. I actually started out on a game design course at Portsmouth I graduated in 2009, and then basically fell into journalism. So I was on the journalism side of the fence for a little while, which pays peanuts, but got to meet some of my idols, got to interview some of the brightest and best minds in the industry, which is absolutely amazing as a young graduate. And then moved through sort of more onto the studio side, so moved through community, marketing and PR, and I'm now the global brand manager at Square Enix, working on a new title with Square. And then in my spare time, I'm a developer as well. So obviously we're going to talk about Three Monkeys, which was part of a company called Incus Games, sort of 5-6 years ago. And then I have a company as well called Superstring, and we kind of do experimental genre hybrids and really narrative focused games. So pretty much if there's something in the games industry, I've kind of done it in a form. I've sort of seen the industry from all angles. But I'd say my heart lies with sort of, the development side and narrative and sort of interesting games that spark the imagination. That's really where my passion lies.
Brilliant. So tell me a bit about how you got involved with Three Monkeys. How did that all start?
So the seed of the idea was from a friend of mine who I went to college with, actually. So he knew I was in the games industry, and he had this idea for an audio game because he was an audio developer. So his whole thing, even at college when I knew him, actually, he was in sound design and music composition, and he did a lot of work with orchestras and sort of composition on that side. But he had this idea for a really simple audio game that was basically about a ninja initiation, and there was this ninja sat in a circle blindfolded, and the ninja had to sort of fend off all the attacks from various attackers coming from within this circle. And it started, he just wanted to prove out binaural audio in that form of this really simple prototype of it was almost like a gimmick game effectively. And then once we kind of got talking about it and sort of the into the thick of the design of it, it just snowballed and really quickly became something that was far greater and faster than that initial concept, but still had that same kind of binaural hook at the core of the game. So yeah, that was Steve Willey, a really great friend of mine, and who eventually we co-founded the company together, and we kind of worked on it as a directing pair, I guess, but it was definitely his sort of baby and idea to begin with.
Had you played an audio game before that time when he got you involved?
You know what? I hadn't.
Okay.
And this is kind of interesting because I think on the surface you would, well, I did. I dismissed it as being something lesser, I guess. I would have thought it was, in my mind, something very simple or something that wouldn't require much thought. And actually, once you go down the rabbit hole of trying some of these games and of actually seeing what they're all about, hearing what they're all about, it shines a whole new light on it. And they are far more powerful in terms of immersion and in terms of story. I think the lack of one sense obviously really amplifies your feelings in terms of the others. And I found it far more immersive and interesting, actually. So while I hadn't experienced many audio games at that point, I've since, played a fair few and seen what they're all about and kind of realized how they're designed and put together and what makes them click.
Yeah. Do you have any favorites? Any favorite audio games?
I think the Nightjar
that's
my
a good
favorite with Benedict Cumberbatch. Really interesting concept, and just I think it had that production value, that that really slick, high production value polish that really brought it to life. And I think actually if you're going to go down the audio game route, you cannot have anything less than the best production value going. The sound design and the audio quality has to be perfect, because obviously you've removed any sense of visuals or graphics. If you're going to hang your hat on just that one sense, it's got to be damn brilliant. And yeah, my job was, it was really slick, so I loved it.
Perfect. So when you first got started on the game, what were some of the things that sort of jumped out at you that were things that you just couldn't approach in the same way that you would do another game narrative?
It's an interesting question. So one of the, I guess, mantras of design that we had was never to make the player feel powerless.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the audio games that I played up until that point were horror, actually. So audio games and horror really meld really well, because you can just use sound design in a way that uses, jump scares, and really you can fluctuate with the audio to such a dramatic effect that you can quite easily create scare tactics. And what we decided very early on in the design was that we weren't going to do that. And all those horror audio games are great, and I'm not putting those down, but they definitely put the player on the back foot. Mm-hmm. And for us, we really wanted to empower the player and make sure that they were, while they don't have sight as a sense, they are still empowered to be a strong and capable protagonist in this world, and that they aren't just there to be shouted and screamed at and sort of backed into a corner. We really wanted the player to be this powerful and strong character within the world.
Yeah, I was about to say that as well. I think it is definitely a sort of common theme, this horror theme or this horror element in audio games. And I was also about to ask you actually how you would approach that. So what are some of the kind of specific things that you did to make the player feel more empowered, or sort of give that back to the player?
Sure. So, I mean, it was largely rooted in combat. So we wanted to make sure that the player could always initiate an attack or defend or have a choice of action at any point within the combat system. So it was effectively a sort of a glorified rock, paper, scissors, but at any point the player could make a decision about which route they wanted to take within a combat scenario. And I think that choice is really key. And I think a lot of the horror-based audio games that we're kind of talking about here are far more linear in that respect. And you'll hit a scenario or a moment in the story that you don't really have a choice within. You just have to react as you might react, which is often a reaction of pulling back and sort of having to run away or move away from whatever that encounter might be like. But with Three Monkeys, we were really keen that the player had real agency over combat specifically, but also in terms of exploration and navigating this world. We were just really striving for choice. And I think when you give the player choice, those elements of horror tend to diminish a little bit, just because you are in complete control. And removing those rails really amplified that for us, and was definitely a core tenet of our design.
Yeah. So I mean, we've been speaking about the narrative for a while now, but why don't you just give us a brief rundown as well of the narrative in Three Monkeys as well?
Sure. So basically the idea was born out of a Japanese sort of maxim it was a pictorial maxim of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Mm-hmm. So the Three Monkeys. That was obviously the most literal form of it, but I was really kind of struck by the notion of taking a sense away and what that sort of proverb represented. So our lead character, our protagonist, Tobar, is the sort of embodiment of see no evil. He is fictionally blind in the world. So he's born into this world a blind person. And when basically a curse befalls the world, it's the world of land of Byzantia, which is a fictional fantasy world. Basically a curse is put on the world that pulls the sun out of the sky and plunges the whole world into darkness. So at this key point in the story, everybody who was, previously sized in this world suddenly has their primary sense taken away. Now, Tobar, born blind, is actually now at an advantage. Rather than his primary sense being, taken away like everybody else in this world, he actually, his other senses are all more finely tuned, and he's far more well equipped to deal with this curse and to, go on this journey across the world to break it, because he was born blind, and therefore he's the perfect hero to take this journey and break this curse. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell. We also had the other two, I guess the two metaphorical monkeys represented in other characters, and generally tried to weave this very quite a grounded sort of fantasy, despite my explanation so far sounding quite sort of fantastical. It was quite sort of a down to earth fantasy, and it was versed in gypsy lore or Romani lore. So read a lot of sort of gypsy folklore and tried to put a spin on fantasy that I felt hadn't been explored before. I wanted to move away from traditional fantasy tropes and try and do something a little bit different in that respect. And I think because we had music and sound as our core means of telling the story, you could do something really interesting in that respect. The type of instruments that we were going to be using, and the type of character, the type of voices and characters that would bring this all to life. So for me, it was quite an interesting take on fantasy. But as we kind of talked about earlier, the game never sadly went into full production. But that was basically the premise, at least, of the story.
Yeah. So the narrative centered around a blind protagonist, which isn't really done very often in games, I would say. And I think you also had a sort of accessibility consultant on board in the sort of pre-production phase. What were some of the things that sort of you learnt from that experience of having someone on board who could actually, consult with you about making it more accessible in terms of narrative, that is then?
Oh, in terms of narrative, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think so. Kevin, who was our consultant, he definitely he was reading through all our sort of scripts and dialogue and putting on that. But where he really offered value was on the kind of the gameplay side of things, and ensuring that we weren't making any assumptions. As sighted designers, we carry a lot of assumptions and sort of biases with us. So he was really instrumental actually in ensuring that we empowered the player. So that he was the one that highlighted to me at least that the genre was so full of these horror games, and I hadn't really noticed it until it was pointed out actually. But he was really saying that he had an appetite for games that would empower him as a player and have because I think all the other games, even though they're audio games, the player in terms of the fiction is sighted still. So sorry, I'm rambling, but the person you play in the game is sighted, but the player isn't. So there's that disconnect, is what I'm trying to say. Whereas Kevin, our consultant, was basically saying that he would prefer to see a game where, in both senses, the player and the character are both visually impaired. And for me, that was a really key distinction. And I know we've spoken about this before, but that's sort of where Kevin's expertise and experience really helped shape the project. So he was less sort of less involved on the story side of things, I would say.
Yeah, cool stuff. And as you mentioned before, because one sense is taken away from you and everything else then becomes sort of heightened, I imagine that narrative then has a much bigger role to play in the whole game design aspect of it. Was that the case with Three Monkeys as well?
Yeah, without a doubt, actually. And that was sort of one of the things that I tried to bring to the table when Steve first approached me about the project, because for him it was sort of a more mechanical, and I was sort of trying to push story a bit more. And I think when sound and audio is your only means of connecting with the world, to your point, sort of story becomes far more important and really vital to immersion and sort of bringing you into this world. So for me, it was all about that richness of lore and story and a full cast of characters and a world that really felt believable by nature of all the dialogue that is pulling you into it. So for me, the story was vital for this to be a success and vital for it to capture people's imaginations. So we, when we took this to Kickstarter, we really hung our hat on the story. It was very much the drum that we kept banging, and while we use tech to some extent and the binaural sound and the proficiency of our sound designers and all that side of it, I think our angle was always story, because I think there's a immediacy to that people really connect with. So yeah, for sure, that was definitely the route.
So what were some of the specific instances where narrative and game design sort of merged together and blended together for you?
So yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think one that really defined our development, at least of the prototype. So for us, it was very much navigation, and one of the things that we were really keen to do from the outset was present a full 3D world, actually. So
Hmm.
kind of referencing it earlier, but a lot of the audio games that I'd played felt very linear, and you're very much on a track and on rails. What we were keen to do was to create a world that could be explored, and the way that we sort of pitched it to ourselves, at least, was Skyrim without visuals, which is the
Okay.
most ridiculous of statements. And that is the one of the loftiest sort of ambitions for the project I think we could have possibly given it. But equally, I think having a audio game that really offered a world that could be explored was something that hadn't been done before, and was therefore that much more important to us to be able to pull off. So what we did then was to create sort of audio markers in the world that could be navigated by. So if we take the example of the village that you wake up in when you first realize that this curse has befallen the land, you'll have 4 points on a compass that you can navigate towards by nature of their sound design. So for example, there's the church bells off to the north. You would have the sound of sort of chickens and a farm off to the east. There might be sort of kids arguing off to the west, and you can hear all these sounds in this sort of bustling village.
Yeah.
And if you were to move and turn to face one, the sound kind of crystallizes and clarifies, and you can, as it gets louder and more clear, you'll obviously know that you're heading in the correct direction to interact with that particular event. So what we did was just create a series of environments. Well, we only managed to create one by nature of the fact the game never made it off the ground, but the plan was to have a series of environments with key audio markers that the player could navigate around by moving towards them. So it's kind of like a sonar or echo based navigation system, which we thought was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So something that I've also found really interesting in audio games is the balance between exposition and imagination, and sort of how different audio games have different approaches with that. Some of them sort of leave everything to the imagination, or a lot to the imagination, while some audio games will sort of try and make up for the lack of vision by giving you a lot of exposition. How did you tackle that in Three Monkeys?
So we were definitely of the former design philosophy. So we really didn't go big on exposition at all. So when you first wake up in the game, the idea was that you're pretty clueless actually, and you had to manually consume all this lore and information and story via your interactions. Because as I was kind of talking about earlier with the navigation, we tried to split up the way our story was delivered into 4 key moments within a scene. So the player could really go and seek this story in any order they liked. Again, this wasn't a linear game. The idea was that it could be consumed in a non-linear fashion. And for me, it was important never to ram it down the player's throat. I wanted them to be able to go off piste and also discover story that isn't actually required for the mainline path to actually understand for comprehension. You could go off and explore any number of side quests and kind of story fillers to some extent that would flesh out this world, but is not core to the main story. And I think that's really important in an RPG in general. That feeling of, that feeling that you're fleshing the world out yourself. And games like, I referenced Skyrim again, but the amount of world building that game does off the golden path is incredible. And we wanted to replicate that in a much smaller form, of course, but just offer content that wasn't integral to comprehension, but that would just add to the flavor and the feeling of belonging in a world that was populated and that had existed for years and years and years, centuries before you'd even got there. And that was really key for us.
That's so awesome. Really cool stuff. So I know you mentioned the project never really ended up in the production phase, but what are some of the things that you were very excited about to sort of get started on game wise within Three Monkeys? Were there some things that you were looking forward to, or some things that were already sort of formed or set in stone that you were going to work on that you would have found very exciting to do?
There were definitely some moments and scenarios later in the game that really bespoke scenarios that kind of would sit outside of the main exploration, but these, I guess they'd be called dungeons in more classic game design, but these dungeons that introduced new mechanics that were really quite interesting. So an example of that would be there's basically this Pied Piper type situation where the children from this local village had all been sort of taken away to this cave by this monster of sorts. And in order to rescue them, you had to engage in this battle of riddles with the monster of this particular network of caves. And the idea was to bring in audio, and I say audio, I mean like player audio, so like natural language from the player rather than from the game. So you'd actually be able to communicate, in a sense, answer these riddles. So I really wanted the player to be able to have to, directly answer these questions that were thrown at them. And if you could move through those sequence of riddles and answer correctly, the children would be freed, and you'd be able to return as a hero to this village. You have to forgive me as well, by the way, because this was sort of 6 or 7 years ago that I first had written this, and I can't remember any of the names or places or anything like that actually at the moment. But that was the core concept, the core sort of idea of putting a spin on giving the player actual free choice to input and answer and involve themselves in this world via their own input. And that sort of ideas that I've built on with subsequent projects actually. But there were many sort of ideas like that used audio in non-combat ways. I think, especially in fantasy type games, combat's usually the default experience. It's like, how do you use sound design to create an engaging combat experience? I think for us as well, it was just as important to create engaging puzzles and moments that you could use your brain as opposed to your brawn. So I haven't got any other examples off the top of my head actually, but that was the main one that really struck me as something that I was sad that we couldn't bring to fruition.
Awesome. And how would you say working on this project has changed the way that you're working now? What have you sort of brought into your current projects that you learnt during the pre-production of this game?
It's an interesting question. Until you sort of analyze it and look back on the projects and work you've completed since then, it's kind of hard to say. But I think a lot of it would be what we were sort of talking about earlier in terms of player assumptions and the biases we take into experiences like this in terms of the characters that we assume the role of. So I think it's a question of fully immersive role playing. So I think when we take control of a character in a lot of games we play today, there's a fundamental disconnect between player and character. And what Kevin, our consultant, taught us, and what I've sort of loved about Three Monkeys, is the fact that we just knocked down that obstacle and that disconnect fully and made the player and the character really sort of one-to-one. And I think that's something that I've strived to replicate in subsequent projects, maybe not successfully, but I think that's sort of really the holy grail of great narrative design and game design, is to just tie player and character more fully. So I think that would be the biggest one. I'm sure there's plenty of others, but that's the one that comes to mind for the moment.
Yeah. And just before we wrap up, tell us a bit about one specific project that you're working on now that you're specifically interested in and excited about.
So the next Superstring game's yet to be announced actually, but I'm literally days away from it happening.
And what space should people sort of keep an eye on if they want to see the updates on that project?
So for the moment, if people head to superstring.studio, all the kind of updates and announcements and trailers and what have you will be hitting there fairly soon. And then just the Superstring social media channels, which are not hard to find off the main superstring.studio website.
Fantastic.
Plug over.
Fantastic. Well, Jamin, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Really interesting conversation, and had a great time.
Thanks very much for your time.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more content, because there are going to be a lot more interviews like this coming up very soon. Next week, I'm going to be interviewing the developers of The Veil, and it's going to be awesome. So please do stick around, and I hope to see you very soon.